Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Mike and Molly. We are back and better with a really exciting MCAT podcast topic for this week, which is how to begin your review of a full length. Now, this is going to kick off our How to Review mini series, just going to cover the next 3 episodes. Mike, I know you're just as excited about this as I am. This is such high yield material. I can't wait.
I know. Working with students, I see so many commonalities when working with so many students, right? Of course, every individual is so unique, but you see the same things all the time. One major thing I see is students right after, and even myself, right after we do an exam, we're like, let me just jump into the passages. Let me just jump into the, getting into the nitty-gritty. But we need to take a step back. And we have to think, okay, what are some overarching things? What are some trends that I can learn from my exam? Because we get so many analytics that from the AMC, from our exams, things that we don't get from the real deal exam that we can actually use to help prep. Because it can tell us so much that getting too lost in the nitty-gritty, we can forget that we can actually use to maximize our score. So I think what we're talking about isn't something that's talked about a lot, but can make huge differences in score.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally agree, right? So for this review mini series, today's episode is how to look at those overarching trends and basically get started brainstorming. How did this exam go for me? What do I expect to see when I start really diving into that nitty gritty? Because like you said, it's so easy to get so lost in it. And I think after having worked with so many students and hearing from so many students, I don't know how to review, right? The most common thing is like I finish a test, I look at my score. Hopefully, if you watched our last episode, you know how to unpack your score, right? You know what it means, right, to get a 506 or to have a 126 in a particular section, right? But then they're like, okay, I guess I'm just going to start with Chem Phys and I'm just going to start clicking through questions and hope that just by diffusion this knowledge enters my brain and stays there, right? I think it comes back to something we've been talking about week after week here, which is being intentional, right? And making sure that you are getting the most out of every hour that you spend prepping, right? And ultimately, you can dive into the nitty gritty without any sort of prep work or groundwork, but you're probably not going to get that much out of it.
Yeah.
So, what our goal is today, before we dive into episodes 2 and 3 of this mini series, which will go through specifically how to break down science passages in review, and then how to specifically break down CARS passages in review, we want to talk about how to just establish the baseline expectations so it gives you a framework to integrate all these things you're learning from individual questions.
Yeah, these are the kind of things that right after you take exam, these are the first things that you do. Before we even get to the passages and nitty-gritty, what to look at first. So that when you actually get to that nitty-gritty, you know what to even look for, you know what to expect, right? And so take me through, Molly. Let's start at kind of like the beginning, right? You just finished an exam, right? You just got your score. Because you watched our last episode, you know exactly what that score means, right? Now what? What do you do?
That's a good question. So the very first thing I want to do is chill out for a moment, at least a couple minutes,
Right.
because so often we go right into the review, like right after that 7.5 hour exam, and that's too soon, right? Take at least a couple minutes, right? But then don't wait too long. What I recommend before you hop in with even looking at your score breakdown, take a sheet of paper, write down what you remember, not about the score, not about the passages, not about questions that tripped you up, but about your actual experience, right? Like, did you feel super pressed for time in a section? Did you feel like halfway through CARS, I was really anxious, or I realized that, I was bringing one passage's anxiety into the next one? Like, was there anything beyond the actual questions that you were doing or the passages you were reading that stood out to you about that? Those I think are very important to consider. especially those environmental factors, because ultimately figuring out those things now allows you an opportunity to work on those so they don't throw you off on test day. That's my step one. Mike,
Mhm.
what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think this is kind of something that we know that feeling of like, oh, I know that how that felt for an exam, but because we don't like put like pen to paper and we don't actually put a voice to it, like we don't address it. Like I've worked with students that they're like, oh, every time I go to an exam, whenever chem phys is tough, it affects cars.
Yep.
Well, when it happened last time, did you change anything this time? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we didn't actually overtly state it and say, okay, I need to make a plan for next time to avoid that. We're just doing the same things over and over again. So I like the idea of like doing it, not right after. Of course, take a minute, take a second.
Take
You're
a
just in
minute at
exams
least.
for 7.5 hours. And then, yeah, get those things out, get those feelings. I know for me, like I remember for my exams when I was doing them, I usually had no idea how I did. Like before I got pressed like submit after psych soc, I would genuinely have no idea how that felt. Because when I was taking the exam, I was just like, I just did it. Right. We'll see how that went. And so if there's anything you can extract feeling wise from that exam, good and bad. Like like don't just put like in my thoughts, we always focus on like the negatives. We're like, oh, I did this thing bad,
Mm-hmm.
I did this thing bad. Celebrate the wins. Like, what did you do well? Was
Yeah.
there a section that, you struggled with chem phys timing and this time around you did well with your timing, you finished on time. Okay. What was the thing? What was the thing you did differently? Oh, let's do that again, right? Celebrate the wins and the losses that you felt right after. But then this is what I personally say, don't do anything else the rest of the day, right?
Oh, I
For
agree.
me, but you just took a 7.5 hour exam. I would always take my exams on Saturday. Take the rest of the day off, right? At this time, if you're simulating test conditions, which I hope everyone is from our conversations of episode 1 and 2, right? You're taking this exam at 8 a.m. You're finishing around 3 or 4-ish, unless you have accommodations, which it will be after. The rest of the day is yours. Relax, do something that you enjoy, spend it with loved ones, do your hobby. Play
Yeah.
video games for all I care, but again, this is your chance to recharge, right? I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I was actually just in a class this morning and we were having that kind of conversation. Students were like, I'm tired. I'm in class. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm taking a full length, which was something we were talking about earlier today. And I was like, listen, guys, you need to give yourself a little bit of a break, especially when you're hitting the gas for like an exam a week, let's say. I'm in total agreement, right? Like you might not look forward to your exam,
Mhm.
right? You might be stressed about the exam, but the best gift you can give yourself during the exam is something to look forward to when it's done. I remember on my actual exam, I was really, really exhausted, especially like chem phys was tiring for me. I like cars because I find it interesting to have so much kind
Only
of
you, Molly.
random stuff
Only you, Molly.
thrown in there, random topics. And then biochem is my favorite section. I live
Oh,
for biochem,
sure.
but I hit psych soc and I was just like, all right, great, my brain is done.
Mm,
And there were times that I'm like, I'm just not even gonna finish this section. Like my brain is not working. But the one thing that kept me going was like, regardless of how this section goes, regardless of how the exam goes, which of course it ended up being all right for me,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Ended up doing okay, we'll
Pretty
say.
okay. Pretty all right.
Pretty okay. Tolerable, tolerable. One of the things that kept me going was, you know what? I'm going to go home. I'm going to see my friends. I'm not going to think about the MCAT. I'm going to be done. I'm going to finally have rest. I can push myself for the last hour because I can do whatever the heck I want when I'm done with this,
Mhm.
right? This is the last push. So for me, that was actually like something that was very specifically beneficial for me on my real day, which was I have something to look forward to after. If I can push for the next hour, I'll have the entire rest of the
Mhm.
afternoon to relax. Um, but I do think there is some value, especially in the practice phase, to recording your thoughts and feelings about how that exam was for you that same day. It could be
Mhm.
an hour later or whenever you want, but I think you're going to forget the experience of taking it if you wait too long, right? You
Mhm.
don't need to hop in with question review, but just take 5 minutes, right?
Mhm.
Just word vomit. What did you recognize? And it doesn't
Mhm.
have to be perfectly organized. It doesn't have to be this, polished essay. It's just, did anything stand out to you?
Mhm.
And Mike, earlier you were talking about how you did this kind of during your exams. And I remember from a previous episode, you took 11. Curious if you could share some of those takeaways from the 11 exams you took and
Mhm.
how that shaped how you did things on actual
Mhm.
test day.
I am so glad that you bring this up because it's funny. I'm a big iPad guy. I love my I when I was in undergrad, my iPad was probably the best investment in my education I ever made because I remember in first year I was like carrying around all my books everywhere, I had like six huge textbooks, but then I could have my iPad where all my notes were. Anyway, the reason I say that is
Like the
I
iPad guy.
a lot of my notes are in my iPad from when I was studying over 5 years ago.
Oh, that's nice.
And so I can see, and
That's
that's because
nice.
the one thing with pen and paper, you're going to lose paper, you misplace it, it
Yeah.
gets thrown out, but all my notes are still there. And so I can see MCAT, like Mike, who was in the trenches, right? What he was feeling, what he was saying. And I can see some of the notes that I had. And I would be reflecting on, my timing, right? That was one of the big things that I struggled with at first, especially on cars. Again, I am going to be the first to say I struggled with cars so much at first. Oh my goodness, especially when it came to timing. I felt like, oh my goodness, how can I finish this exam while also doing well? And this is also the most important section for Canadians. Like, I was so
Yes.
stressed. Like, that was the one
Oh,
section. Psych Soc, I just felt like I never could know enough terms where I felt like the panic would come up sometimes and I wouldn't think straight when in reality, in my review, I found that, oh, I had everything I needed. Like these are kind of the big things that I reflected on after. Like it was cars and psych soc. Chem and bio, like I'm with you, Molly, especially when it comes to bio, I loved bio.
mhm.
Bio was like one
Most
thing.
people probably do.
Yeah, right. It's very familiar to what we know, right?
Yeah.
I also love I love literature. I love data, like the data analysis part that I noticed like students like the anatomy
Oh,
portion.
I thought you meant cars literature,
Oh,
like
no,
English
no,
literature. No, you're
no,
talking
no, no.
scientific literature.
Scientific
Ah,
literature.
okay.
No,
Now
no.
this makes sense
I
again.
was I was like, no, no, no. Cars was not a fan. I was not a fan.
Yeah, yeah,
Hey,
okay.
now I am. Now I am. Huge fan. But yeah, I love the sciences. So usually my takeaways from sciences were always good. Right? I love the bio. I love bio. Chem phys. I was like a physics tutor before I even took the MCAT. And so
Nice.
I was fairly proficient in physics and the chemistry. Chem phys, I did struggle sometimes with, again, a little bit with my timing. I didn't have as much time as I would the other sections. But again, I'm kind of just taking me back to like, because I remember jotting these things down. Like, what's my
Yeah.
game plan for next time? What am I going to do differently next time? Because I think that's the big key, right? Because I'm a big person about action. I want to do something. So if I'm going to write this down, right next to it would be, what am I going to do differently next time? You don't have to have an answer now. Before you take that next exam, there has to be something different. Or else what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, if you do stuff, if you make mistakes or you have an experience and you don't learn from it, that's just a waste of time, right?
Hmm.
I'm all about that. I like that. You're a man of action.
I love
Love them.
let's do something, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because if you're not, then you're not going to grow, right?
Right.
And that comes with the discomfort of the growth mindset, right?
Hmm.
That's why it's so amazing when you do it, but why
Hmm.
it can also be very intimidating when you're just
Hmm.
kind of getting your feet wet with this, right? You do really embrace a growth mindset. It turns your weaknesses or your failures into the best growth opportunities that you're going to have,
Hmm.
right? Those are the things that you treasure the most.
Hmm.
But one thing that kind of hits on what we're talking about is sometimes what we think went poorly isn't actually what went poorly. And
So
sometimes
true.
what we think we did really well on, we actually didn't.
Hmm.
And sometimes putting pen to paper before you look at your scores and before you analyze every passage, it can be really telling. Like for me, I was I was a bio tutor
Hmm.
before I took the MCAT. I actually had taught bio in different contexts for years before that. All different types and levels of biology. So I knew, right? I knew that was something I was proficient at. But I didn't have the strongest chem phys background when I was first taking my MCATs and my full lengths. Just didn't have the best experience in undergrad. And I was really scared about that all the time. And so when I would do this kind of reflection, I'd be like, chem phys was horrible. I felt like, I just did not feel prepared. But then when I got to the next stage, which is look at each section's score, I was often surprised. Like, I actually did pretty well in Chem Phys. Like,
Hmm.
that was actually not a bad section for me. But my emotional side, I doubt myself so much. And that was actually something, this experience of handwriting, what I felt, was actually huge in me kind of overcoming that fear of Chem Phys, which, of course, like you mentioned with cars, is now a section I love. It's
Hmm.
actually one of my favorite to teach because I struggled with it.
Interest,
Um,
yeah.
And I think it's probably one of the ones I'm better at teaching because of that. But it really helped me get past that fear and anxiety of Chem Phys because I could see my fears and anxieties written out and they were authentic. I hadn't even seen my score when I wrote that. And then I would look at my score. I'm like, wait a minute, I know so much more than I thought I did.
Mhm.
Like I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't have these fears that ultimately can inhibit score progression, right? They can make you
Mhm.
score lower because of the fear and the anxiety of it. And I feel like that was really instrumental in moving past it.
Yeah.
So getting your feelings on paper and then actually looking at your score, looking how you performed on a broad scale, which is kind of falling in line with last episode's topic, which is understanding score broadly, overall composite score, and then also section specific. Um, you want to get some idea of like, what's my path forward?
Mhm.
Right. And I know that both of us, right, having taught so many people for so many years through this exact process, I think we both have kind of score ranges that we've put together over the years of like, if you're scoring in this range in a section, you might want to think this is your issue or this is your path forward. Um, I'm curious if we have the same numbers. Mike, I want to hear from you. What are you advising students based on your score? What should you do? What
Mhm.
should you expect?
Sure. No, I think this is, I always like seeing these things because over time you start seeing these patterns. I want to preface these are generalizations. Like this isn't like a non always, but generally if a student is scoring between like a 118 and a 122 in the sciences, at least for me, I'm thinking that one of our priorities at this point probably should be content along with strategy. But generally, what I see is if we're scoring in that range, there's just some things that we might not be getting, not even just in the questions, but hampering our understanding of the passages. Like we always say, like, oh, I didn't know this content, so I couldn't answer the question. But content understanding helps to give preface for these passages as well. Like if it's an enzymes passage, but you don't understand enzymes, you're not going to be able to even
Yeah.
engage with it at all, and it's really going to inhibit it. And so when you're in that range, there's probably a content issue along with strategy, but it's probably inhibiting your strategy because you don't know the content, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Again, this is for the sciences. Cars is like a whole nother beast, of
Whole
course.
another thing, which we will talk about.
We will talk about.
Yeah.
If I mean, what's kind of your range for that? Like, because I know you have kind of a similar mindset. What's your sort of range there, Molly?
Yeah, I think 122, 123, it kind of depends on the section.
Mm,
But I totally agree. When we're scoring in that range, I would say yes, you probably have a strategy. Everyone can improve on strategy all the time, but to me, content is like the prerequisite to unlock full strategy, right?
sure.
Like it's without at least a foundational amount of content. Like I'm talking like 50, 60% understanding. If we think of 100% of the material that's testable, like
Mhm.
a solid 50% or 60%, then you can start to recognize, oh, okay, this passage, I haven't covered this material yet. I need to focus on this material so that I can learn to understand passages like these. But especially in those early stages when we know maybe like 20 or 30% of the content, every passage is a mystery. And at the end of the day, when you get to the questions, there's really no way to tell why you missed it because you don't know what you should about the topic. And so you can't recognize what is passage specific and what is stuff you should know. So
Mhm.
when you get to the questions, there's no way to tell, is this a fact I should know? Is this an application of something I should know? Is this an entirely passage based phenomenon? Right?
Mhm.
Without the ability to make those decisions, improving in strategy is going to be a lot harder. So I
Mhm.
agree. I would say below a 122 or 123 in a given science section, you ultimately will need to work on content and strategy, but work on getting us up to that 50, 60% understanding barrier.
Mhm.
And then you can start working in both.
Mhm.
So 122, 123. And if you're past that and you're up to maybe like a 127 ish,
Mhm.
for me, and again, I'm curious what you think. It's always fun to compare notes.
Mhm.
For me, that's okay. You might have certain content areas that are a little bit weaker. It's nothing glaring, right? You may know maybe 50 or 60%. So we still have content we need to work in, but we also need to work in strategy. So for me, I think start doing practice questions, but integrate the content you're unfamiliar with as you're learning it so that you're kind of hitting on both content and strategy
Mm,
at the same time in your prep.
mhm.
Are you
Yeah.
thinking like 127 or what's your cutoff?
Yeah, it really depends. 127, 128 is the range because I feel like once you're at that point, you are getting most of the questions that most people get right, right,
True,
right.
true, true.
So like, because when you start getting into that 127, 128, now you're getting into the upper percentiles. Now you're getting into the
Yeah.
80th, 90th, past that point. And so, but if you're not, if you're between that 123 mark that we talked about before and
Mhm.
127, like if you're in that range, getting up to that range involves again solidifying that content and again applying that strategy like you said with passage practice, but then getting up above that. I talk with so many students who are like, Mike, like I am already at a one. Again, students come to me like I'm at a 128, 129 right now. I want to
Mhm.
get to the 130 pluses. What do I need to be doing? This is
Yes.
where and this is going to be this might be an extreme statement, but content's not helping you at this point anymore, right?
Agreed. No,
To
I
get
agree.
yeah, to get at this point, you know your stuff. You have an understanding of your content, but now the questions that you're missing are the questions that most people don't get, right? Are the
Mhm.
questions that are in the upper percentiles, because really the difference between a 130, a 131, a 132 are a matter of two, three questions a lot of the
Yeah.
times, right? And
Yeah.
so a lot of times, and of course there might be specific content things, but again, usually it isn't. Um, it's really a matter of did you apply your strategy well? Did you eliminate rather than try? Again, that's the one of the big strategies I love, like
Yeah.
eliminating, stop trying to look for the right answers all the time.
Yeah.
Again, we'll talk into specific science strategy at a later time. But like I'm kind of teasing it now. But again, mastering strategy, that's how you get into that upper range. And so these are kind of things that I sort of went in that initial look through, right? And when I'm looking at my overall trends, before I even look at my passages, right? I'm saying, okay, where was I on that scale? So that
Mhm.
when we look at the passages, right, I can see like, what should I be looking out for? Yeah, if I'm scoring 118, 122, I'm going to be looking for the passages, for those passages where there was content I didn't know,
Yeah.
right? These are prefaces. The purpose of what we're talking about right now is to preface, right? When you actually start your review, when we talk about the things that we'll talk about next episode, right? You already know what you're looking for. It's like going to a grocery store with like a grocery list, right? Like
Yes. Love that.
if you go into the grocery store without a grocery list, you'll spend forever there. You won't know what to look for. You'll
Probably won't get what you needed.
get what you need. You'll focus on all the wrong things. But this is essentially what we're doing is making the grocery list. What is the thing that I need? Or the thing that I can kind of the trend tells me so that when you actually look at your passage, oh, I can see where I need to improve now, right? Because again, I see students who dive into it before taking that first kind of overarching trend, and they're like, I don't even know how to improve at this point, right?
Yeah. I love that you think of it like a grocery list because whenever I go into a grocery store without a grocery list, I just immediately go to what like feels good. Like, oh, I'm
Right.
gonna go to the snack aisle, right?
Hmm.
I'm gonna go get a bunch of junk food. And I
Sure.
feel like that's kind of true also of the MCAT. Like when you don't have any structure, I think many people, especially if we're still kind of mastering that growth mindset, kind of to acknowledge a question you got wrong and to really investigate is very uncomfortable. So
Hmm.
sometimes we kind of pull back a little bit from the
Hmm.
things that we should be really learning from and focusing more on the things that are more comfortable for us.
Hmm.
But again, we need to unlearn that. We need to be comfortable or be comfortable being uncomfortable as backwards as that sounds.
Hmm.
And I think going in with an intention is super valuable.
Hmm.
Plus, as you start to do more exams, and you start to collect additional data, it's really nice to see how is my score per section fluctuating,
Hmm.
right? Am I pretty solid at a particular score? Am I plateauing, right? Am I increasing steadily? Is my score fluctuating wildly, right? It gives you a lot of insight into how you are applying your strategies and whether or not the strategies you're trying are serving you well, right? So again, we will dive into a lot more of the specifics for how to break down a passage in the coming episodes. Next week for science, or next episode for science, and the following for cars. But um, there's a lot of value in looking at your score and trying to figure out what should I be expecting in my
Hmm.
review? What kind of skills or knowledge should I be hoping to build? And ultimately, this knowledge doesn't just come from the score that you get, right, after each section. It also comes with those analytics you were mentioning earlier. We have analytics and AMC has analytics. How do you suggest a student goes about using these?
Right. And I love our Jack Weston analytics because I think, I mean, this is maybe biased, and probably it is biased, but I think we give a lot more specifics than the AMC does because the AMC has
Yeah,
big like overarching analytics, right? It's like, there's this broad area and this broad area and these questions. However, like when we do like a Jack Weston exam, I love how we break it down by like subject area and by difficulty. I think that's one of the big ones where we rate it by difficulty as well.
yeah,
Where it's like, are you like, and again, especially if you're at those upper ranges in scores, what kind of questions are you getting wrong? Those hard questions, like quote unquote hard that we rate, usually aren't ones that are just based on content. They're usually good strategy ones, reading analysis ones. And so usually, again, first thing that I do when I actually start looking at my trends, again, usually not the same day as my exam, because again, I wrote down my feelings, like how I felt by that exam, then I took a break for the rest of the day. But when you actually pick up your review, right? I like kind of looking at it overarching, right? Chem phase, I got X score. What, based on my trends, what were the kind of questions I was getting right and incorrect? Because again, this can get me started before I even look at the questions, right?
yeah.
I start looking at not only the question breakdown, but the question difficulty as well as the question timing, right?
Yes.
That's,
Um,
that's, sorry, what you were saying?
no, go
No.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, when it comes to timing, right? I think this is one thing that when I talk with students, when it comes to their data and analytics, is one thing that I think they don't focus on enough. Because I mean, Molly, how many times have you had a student that's like, I'm struggling with timing, like on my
Everyone.
section? Literally
Everyone struggles with timing.
every single time. Yeah, we're like,
Timing is the scapegoat, the ultimate scapegoat of all MCAT struggles,
for
right?
sure.
But ask yourself, if you didn't have a time limit, could you get every question right? If the answer is no, timing is not your number one issue.
Right? But it can still be an issue, especially if you're not
Yeah.
like finishing the exam. And it's
Yes.
funny, students come to me like, Mike, I'm not finishing the exam. What do I need to do? And I'm like, I have no idea. Let's take a look at your exam. And they completely ignore looking at where did they spend their time? Because I think that's always the first step, right? Is if you're struggling with timing, where are you spending it then? Right?
Yeah.
Look at these trends to begin with to see, was I spending it on specific questions? Was I consistently spending more time? Was I, because again, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear about for you, Molly, like what are your time benchmarks for like where you should be spending your time on the exam?
Yeah. So when we talk about timing, right, when you look, and just to break it down in case you haven't seen this before, right? Let's talk AMC, right? Gold standard AMC. People who write the test, when you take a full length with them, when you're done and you click on a particular section, right? Because you'll get a screen that shows your overall score. It'll show you your score in each section. If you click on a section, it'll open up this screen that displays your score from 118 to 132. It'll display your number of questions correct, your percentage accuracy, your percentile, whatever. It'll also show you from a bird's eye all the questions, and you can see how much time you spent on each question. You can also see whether you flagged it, whether you got it correct or incorrect, etc. You can absolutely look at this screen before you start reading every question and passage, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about. So if you are looking at just that timing column and you're scrolling through, what I want you guys to be looking for is anything that you're spending too much or too little time on, right? So this is going to be different for passages versus discretes. For a discrete, I would say for the most part, and I guess I should say for any question, for the most part, about a minute is a good thing to shoot for. If
Mhm.
it's a simpler question or if it's a passage based question about something you understood, sometimes we're faster at a high accuracy. More power to you, right?
Amazing.
But I think spending more than 2 minutes for a question without that being the first question of a passage is probably a red flag, right?
Mhm.
What I tend to see with students is the questions that you spend more than 2 minutes on. Chances are you probably got it wrong at the end of the day, anyways. In which case, don't don't waste so much time on that,
Mhm.
right? You'll start to recognize if there are certain types of questions, for example, tough calculation questions that just you tend to spend a lot of time on that don't end up contributing to your answers correct at all. If you would have recognized that early, flag guess, move on, come back to it later if you have time. Maybe you could have bumped your score up by giving yourself more time for some of those other questions you have a higher accuracy for. I do just want to comment though, like I kind of alluded to a second ago, if you are looking at the very first question associated with the passage, you're going to see something that's maybe 4 or 5 minutes long, and that's totally okay. 4 or 5 minutes for that first passage-based question is totally appropriate because most passages, and this is a big generalization, especially in science, where you can have short
Super long and
short
super long. Yeah.
content or long experimental. 4 to 5 minutes is about where we're shooting for, right? Maybe 3 to 4 minutes for the passage, and then maybe a minute or so for the question. So you'll see every couple questions, you have one long one. You could click on it. Is this the first question of the passage? Yes. Okay. That's okay. Right. But anything much shorter than 4 minutes, maybe we're not spending enough time in the passage. Anything much longer than 5, that passage or question was probably a little bit confusing for you. And again, timing is one that you can unpack a lot.
Right. Even before we even look at the questions, like again, like we learn so much just from these things, right? Like, if you are finding, right, that you are struggling with time, right? That's one of the first things you should look at. Because again, like I was saying before, so many students come in saying, I'm struggling with time. They've finished their review of their questions, but have no idea where their time is going. Let's go look. Let's go find out. And so now again, even without the questions, we can start making strides. We can start making game plans. If we're finding that, in the passage, for example, that first question of a passage, right? That first question of a passage, and including the passage time, we were saying 4 to 5 minutes. It's always a red flag for me whenever I see it taking less than like 3 or less than 2 minutes. Whenever it's like less than that for me, I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
unless this is truly a really short passage, we are not giving the passage the kind of, I say, the respect that it deserves, right? Because again, I like to respect these passages to actually understand them before we get to the questions. Because what you'll find, I mean, this is just for me in the bio section, right? When you understand the passages, the questions become so much more straightforward,
Oh
right?
yeah,
So much more
big time.
straightforward, right? And again, you'll recognize that in the timing. And so these are the trends I'm looking for. So it's not just too long, but also too short. Again, if you're getting discrete questions right and it's taking you 20 seconds, again, all the power to you, like you said,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But it's in the passage reading time that I see red flags everywhere, right?
Yes, I
Um,
completely agree.
yeah. So
Yeah.
again, so that overarching analytics, right? Huge. There's so much to look at that's just outside of just those specific questions.
Yeah, and timing is a great place to kind of get your feet wet. But I also want to draw attention to 2 resources, and it depends on whether you're doing Jack Weston or AMC, that you may or may not be using, right? Mike, you mentioned the Jack Weston analytics page. Again, if you just took a Jack Weston full length, which we have 6 for free on our website, pretty awesome. Go check them out, right? High quality MCAT prep should not break the bank. Definitely use those. Between AMC providing 6 and Jack Weston providing 6, that's 12 exams. That's more than enough, especially given that ours are free. So check them out. If you do a Jack Weston full length and you hit the analytics tab, right, you'll see everything that you do on our website. But if you are just leaving that particular exam, you could also look at the exam specific analytics. And this is what Mike was saying, where you'll get a breakdown of everything that you did, right? And how well you scored in each content area, each question type, etc. That's a great place to find those broad, sort of zoomed out trends that will ultimately not directly affect your study plan. I don't want you making any changes to what you're doing just based off this broad overview. However, it can inform what you're looking for when you do that granular review. For the AMC, and this I want to stress because I've worked with so many students who never knew what this was. They have a tab. I was describing earlier what the screen looks like when you pull up an exam. There's a tab for each section of the exam. If you click on your score for biochem, it'll pop up a tab that says content and skills breakdown. Click on that. It is a holy grail because it will show you how did you do based on question type skill. So skill 1, skill 2, skill 3 that go from anything from like a pretty straightforward content question to like more of a passage reasoning question? Is it reasoning about the design of an experiment or research, or is it just straight up data interpretation, right? So it will break your score down, your performance down by question skill type, which is amazing, especially for those of us who are scoring a little higher, but useful to everyone to figure out what question types am I doing well on and maybe not as well in. It will also break down all of your content performance based on the foundational concept or the concept category that the AMC has in their outline. So they'll say, hey, 3B, which is all the organ systems in bio, you answered 12 out of 20 correct, or, 8 out of 15. There are two things you get from this. One, you get your percent accuracy, which is great, right? You could see where am I losing points, but you can also see how frequently was this particular like area of content asked about. And that is telling you how high yield this material is too. So when you're looking at the breakdown by those granular content areas through AMC, you're seeing not just your accuracy, which of course we want to focus on our lower accuracy subjects if we want to grow, but you'll also see yield. So for example, if you had one that you had 12 out of 20 answered, and then you had one that was like maybe 1 out of 4 correct, you might want to spend time on that 12 out of 20 concept area before you dedicate hours and hours to studying that 1 out of 4 accuracy. Because even though your percentage accuracy is higher in the 12 out of 20 accuracy, that is just so much more represented on that test, right? So you get a lot of information about you, but also how high yield different concept areas are. And then of course you can hop to the What's on the MCAT exam PDF that the AMC has on their website, which if you search exactly that, it'll pop up. And you can figure out what exactly do I need? And then what resource do I have that I could brush up on that material? Come to our course sessions, right? Check out the lectures we have online. Check out the free AMC outline. Come to some of our free sessions where we do content topics, right? Get whatever you need and then test again, right? So just to kind of nutshell, I know I've been talking for a while about this, but I think it's really important to know what you're looking for, right? And there are resources through Jack Westin and AMC after you take your test that will help you come to these broad conclusions. It's easier to start with the broad and then use that to go through the granular passages than reverse. It's really hard to just study and click through passages and questions for hours and then have this epiphany of, oh, I need to learn this. So the top-down approach tends to be easier for students, at least in my experience, than the reverse.
Right. No, I think that's always the best first step is first identifying the one. Because again, one thing you and I hear all the time is how do I improve? I can't tell you how many times I've taught a class or being even one in our free trial sessions that we hold every single week where a student asks, how do I improve my score?
Yes.
Well, that's something where we need some more info. I mean, you need some more info, right?
Yeah.
We need to know what is it that we're struggling with first, right? I can't tell you how to improve your score unless we find out what are you struggling with from your trends. If your trend tells you you're struggling with data interpretation, I'm not going to be the one to tell you you need to work on your data interpretation. But what this is the first step to do is now we can start making a plan because that's always the thing we're struggling with. How do I move forward? This is
Yeah.
how we start, right? I'm struggling with data interpretation. Therefore, let's make a plan. Maybe I'm not using my strategies correctly. Maybe I don't even have a strategy. Maybe I should look into getting a strategy, which sort of begins talking about this game plan, making a plan that we're going to be talking about in future episodes. Well, I think that kind of like is a really good kind of segue into what we'll be talking about next week, isn't it? Or next
I
episode.
think so.
Yeah.
I think so, right? Because we're talking about how to get these broad trends, but ultimately, a broad trend is only valuable in that it directs your attention when you dive deeper, right? This is not enough just to look at the content and skills breakdown or the Jack Westin Analytics tab. You need to look at every passage. You need to look at every question, and you need to be asking yourself the right questions when you do. Just staring at a question and saying, oh, this is a content thing, need to learn electrochemistry.
and then move on.
That
Oh
does
my
nothing
goodness.
for
I see that too.
you.
I see that way too often, right? Where it's
I
like,
know.
need to learn this. Like, okay, but
Ah,
oh
yeah.
my goodness. No,
It's
don't do this, please.
Yeah, especially when it's a student I'm working with and I'm looking at their like little feedback form or their review tracker and they're like, need to learn, insert this incredibly complicated pathway that they do not need to know. That's what the entire passage is about. And I'm like, okay, flag the question. We're going to talk about this one next. Like, I don't even know what this is, right? Like you're not supposed to. It's in a passage. We're going to talk all about how to figure out what is a content issue and what is a passage issue and how to navigate that decision. Should I use content knowledge or passage knowledge for a question? How to learn from your granular mistakes in each question or passage, all of that. Next week's episode is probably going to be a pretty mega one because that's
Huge.
what we're doing,
Right.
right?
That's we're talking about all those things.
I
So like
know.
I'm getting like my caffeine ready. I'm like, because there's
I
so much
know.
to talk about. So no,
I
I'm
think
excited. I'm excited for it.
I'm really excited too. I
Mm,
feel like we're gonna get maybe a little too animated at certain times, from
so much
just
rage.
being too much like
Mm, mm,
we've seen students again waste so much time but also so much energy and open
mm,
up the door for so much self-doubt with things that do not have to be the end of the world and do not have to be as scary as they seem like they should,
mhm,
right? So get excited.
mhm.
Next episode we are talking about how to review a science passage, and again the episode after that we're doing the same thing with
For
cars.
cars. And hey, we'll have a special guest on for that episode, possibly. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. See if
Mhm.
you can guess who it might be.
Who do you think it might be?
Let us know in the comments who you want to see us talk cars with. Um, but I hope you guys enjoyed episode 1 of our How to Review mini series. Get excited. The next 2 weeks, we're going to really dive in passage by passage. How do we get the most out of it? We can't wait to see you then. Until then, happy studying. I hope you have a phenomenal rest of your week or weekend or holiday break, whenever you're listening.
Wherever we're finding you right now.
Yeah. And we'll catch you in the next one.
Bye
Bye,
now, everyone.
everyone.